My name is Raki Rajani. I'm an associate partner at Quantum Black. I'm a psychologist by background and have always worked in innovation. On the panel today, we have a great group of people, and we're going to talk about some hopefully very interesting things. So I'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we will get into some questions, and then we will open up the floor to questions to see what else you might want to ask us. So Kate Robson-Brown is a professor of biological anthropology and the director of the Jean Golding Institute, which focuses on data science and data-intensive research at the University of Bristol. She is also a fellow at the Turing Institute. So, Kate, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Dr. David Prendergast is a social anthropologist who, until recently, worked for Intel and is now professor in science, technology, and society in the Department of Anthropology at Maynooth University. David, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dagmar Steffens is lead for legal tech at UWE and an authority on legal innovation. She's practiced as a corporate lawyer at Osborne Clarke before joining UWE, at first teaching in legal practice and then moving on to the world of academia. And I think very soon to be joining the West of England Combined Authority to develop and lead their innovation and sector development service. So thank you, Dagmar, for sharing your insights with us here today.
Thanks.
And finally, Dr. Mark Woods is head of autonomy and robotics at CITES, where he leads the autonomy and robotics group, specializing in applications that enable autonomous exploration, survey, and analysis of complex environments, things like Mars, just small things like Mars. So thank you all. We've been inspired by the topics of conversation that we've heard this morning and throughout the day. And so we have a few questions that we are going to kick off with, or I'm going to kick off with the panel. The first is, I think, Kate, I think I'll direct this one at you, around, are we creating irreversible debt? And by that I mean the tech community talks a lot about technical debt, right? And often it gets kind of put to the side and we do something with it when we have time. But the question I have here is, we're getting into new social and decision-making situations with AI. And how do we actually solve for those without creating generational debt, social debt, ethical debt, and all those other things that we've heard the folks in the room here talk about today?
Yes, thanks. I think this is a really interesting question, and one that we've also addressed at the institute that I direct, which is an institute for data science and data-intensive research, so actually very multidisciplinary. And we also have many collaborative partners from different industrial, commercial and third sectors, including fintech. And I was in a conversation just a couple of weeks ago with one of those, where we started talking about whether or not it's possible, for example, through, let's say, financial transactional behaviour, to identify clients or customers that have vulnerabilities. And our interest is twofold. So one, is there a regulatory requirement to address vulnerability if it's there to be seen? So can we actually find it, whether that's using analytical statistics or AI machine learning? And then secondly, should we go out of our way to identify those vulnerabilities? And if we do that, what do we then do with that information? At what point do we then feed that back to the community, or can we use that as part of a business model internally? And I think these are really interesting and quite intractable issues. And the second part of that debt, I think, that I'd like to pick up on is the sense that I have from my own research area, that there is still huge social inequality of access to digital products and technology, which means that any data-driven decision-making that we might implement on those platforms is necessarily also reflecting a lack of diversity and an inequality. And so I think we need to kind of discuss ways of addressing that at the very grassroots level, really, as important, and place that in as much importance as actually looking at the top level issues.
So, I mean, anthropologically, so socially and ethically, that raises a huge number of questions. I wonder, excuse me, Dagmar, do you have an opinion on what that means from an ethical standpoint.
But certainly for me, what you said, Kate, rings bells when I think about the administration of justice and digitalization of our justice system, where we certainly are in the process and have already created social debt, I think, and ethical debt by using technology that might not have been ready for the way it is being deployed by the courts and by the prison service, for example. So there are many ethical questions about not doing bad and about doing good in our criminal justice system in particular. We've had people convicted, arrested, charged with an offence that they might normally have got a caution on the basis of potentially their race, the place they have been arrested, by applying AI algorithms. So I can certainly see that if public service carries on the way it does with digitalization, a lot of thought needs to be spent on these questions of debt.
David, from your perspective, from a social perspective, what are you seeing here?
I'm just thinking about what you just said, Ashley, and it kind of brings me back to Wu and Zhang's paper. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but they produced a paper in November 2016, which is on automated inference for kind of facial recognition around criminality, and they basically kind of making the case that they've identified a law, where, you know, based on people's faces, you know, in terms of to identify that, you know, within a Chinese population who were criminals and who weren't, and you know they're saying they're absolutely proving this, you know, within the system. And I think kind of when you look at that data, it's not just down to it's how they're gathering, you know, the images, for instance, you know, like they've been gathering, you know, from government IDs, but actually within the non-criminal section, they've been taking them off corporate websites and headshots. And I think kind of the types of expressions that you're going to have in those situations are going to be very different. And I think we need to be very, very careful. I've got a PhD student who's just finished writing his PhD on the subject of the early anthropologists and post-evolutionism, etc. And, you know, I mean, kind of we're looking at the Dublin Anthropometry Laboratory and the growth of that, and skull measuring, etc. And it kind of strikes me the dangers that people like Francis Galton went into when, you know, with this focus on measurement. And I think it's a very important focus. Lots of good things came out of the early kind of focus on healthcare and kind of looking at eyesight. And if you read like some of the literature they were producing early on in that, it was very much about, well, we need kind of standardized measures for, and you know, for people's eyesight, etc. And then it moved into an entirely new discourse about race and superiority of race, you know, and the discourse changed. And I think we need to be very careful in these kind of situations. And I think kind of, you know, ethically as researchers, we need to be kind of be more critical about how we kind of tackling these issues.
Very interesting. To me, that kind of kicks us off into, I mean, we've talked about the ethics at some point, but how do we keep AI in check? There's, you know, are there regulations for this? How do we think about this? And one of the questions that came up on Slido was in response to Simon's talk, Simon's in the room, which was, can a self-driving car be thought of as embodied intelligence with wheels instead of limbs? I'm going to throw this to you, Dan. Where do we go with this one?
Well, I said when we discussed this earlier that it reminds me of the 19th century sort of fledgling company law, where it was for the first time established in law that companies were separate legal entities from the people who owned and ran them. And there was always that talk about the company not having a brain to act and not having the limbs to act. And it reminded me of that. Can that be somehow transferred and therefore then alleviate the responsibility for that autonomous vehicle or whatever it is? There is a case, it's known as the Spanish Google case, where the European Court of Justice decided that Google was arguing that a particular act, it was search engines throwing up search results, and the search results were disputed by the complainant. And Google was arguing that once the complainant had typed in the search, the application of the algorithm that then threw out the search results was not Google's responsibility. So it stopped at that point. And the European Court of Justice decided that that was not the case and that Google was responsible for the application of the algorithm and the results that the search threw out. So I think there's a question between policy and law. We talk a lot about policy, and every nation that is proud of itself at the moment throws out a policy about AI. So we've got the EU really busy. They've drafted their ethical AI rules, and they're now testing them in the real world. We've got various countries formulating AI ethic policies, but policies are not democratically produced. They're not like laws. Laws are produced by our democratic parliaments, so they have buy-in, and everybody can say, even if they don't agree with the law, that it was produced in a democratic manner. Policies are not, and therefore a policy can potentially be the basis for a law. And I'm not against policies, but I think we need to go further in certain areas. And what lawmakers do is they apply the principle of is it actually necessary to have a law in this particular area? Is there already a law we can apply? So there might be one we can transfer, like GDPR might be applicable. Is there law in other areas? For example, is there law in pharmaceutical regulation that can be applied to AI maybe? Or do we really need to have a new law? So I would argue that in certain circumstances there should be a law, and if there's uncertainty about whether the car is a responsible act or not, then maybe that's a case to be made.
How does this play out for you, Mark, when you're talking about sending robots to other
strange place.
other planets?
Actually, no, it does bring up another example. We did some work with an infrastructure body, and one of the things that come up there was obviously currently if we take machine learning as a sort of technology, and let's say there's a contractual arrangement where you develop a system based on machine learning, so you're using data to create that system, and contractually you hand that system off to the customer who's purchased that system. If they then make changes to that, then who's responsible for the impact of that behavior? Because one of the problems of a system like that is it's impossible sometimes to extensively test it. And unlike maybe, say, more traditional ways of developing software, you can't necessarily fully realize the impact of those changes and what they might be in the overall performance of the technology. And one of the conclusions that we came from with this particular working body was that in some instances where changes are made to systems like that, it's going to need the sign-off, if you like, of some of the engineers who were involved at that early design phase to sort of cover the actual regulatory risk aspect. Because, if small changes in data are made to sort of fine-tune the system, who's best placed to say what the actual impact and the risk of that will be? And sometimes it will be some kind of, probabilistic call as to whether or not it's going to create a big problem or not. So I think this is an evolving space, and I think there's quite a bit of work to be done to touch on that.
Yeah, I think that raises a really interesting question. So if you were working in the medical sphere, you might run a clinical trial.
Yeah.
And the framework within which a clinical trial will work is understood, certainly within nations. What does a trial look like for a digital twin?
Yeah.
Or for a data analytics process? How far I'm asking a question really,
Yeah.
I have you. How far are we down the road of understanding that?
It's an open problem. It's the validation and verification of autonomous systems. So the old techniques we've used to thoroughly validate that this thing we're going to build is going to work well just don't scale up for autonomous systems, and that's where the risk lies, and that's why you're seeing problems emerge. That's why you're seeing headlines that just don't work. I mean, frankly, the autonomous driving world at the minute is essentially using the cities they're operating as a lab. So the way that the problem is being solved is to use the world as a lab. Now, developing robots on Mars, I take my robots to the desert and we test there. It's usually pretty safe. We don't expect to find aliens and so on and so forth. But, that's one example. But in the urban case, people are in that lab, right? And there's risks being run as a consequence. So it is a problem. And there isn't a solution to them to say just how will we definitively V&V a system like that and make sure it's 100% reliable. So therefore it comes down to some judgment, like a lot of risk. It's a balance of probabilities. And I guess the question then is how do we make sure that risk is well judged and well informed.
And if it comes to roost, who's going to be liable?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Sorry.
So we've been running an interesting kind of experiment at the moment in the Institute where we've taken a data set and we've made it open to run a reproducibility project. So we have a data set and a question.
Yeah.
We've had 70 groups around the country use different methodologies to answer that question with our data set.
Yeah.
And what we've actually, it's called the MAPS project, you can go online and have a look. What we've actually found is that people tend to have solutions which are about a third of the volume of solutions that are possible that are out there. So we're actually, I'm looking at the psychologist now, we're actually not individually exploring all the possible routes to understanding how reliable those answers are. And that really exposes to me the fact that we need a lot more research in this area to understand the conflicts that lie there.
So a question I would have then, if we're only seeing people looking at one third, I mean, together, are we getting a whole picture, or is it still too fragmented?
It's still I would say it's still too fragmented, that we're probably defaulting to analytical tools because they're easier or they're cheaper or something. And so we're not, when it's certainly an experiment that we've run, we're not seeing all the possible solutions for that data set. And this is a small, fairly simple data set with a simple question. So what happens when you start to ask very complex questions of big, messy, real-world data? I don't know.
Yeah, which speaks to where are people coming from when they ask those questions,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Because it's your biases that come into that. So
Yeah,
sorry,
and back to that, and also the original point about policy and law and ethics. I suppose that, we have to start tackling this in a much more systematic fashion now, I think. I think things have changed, are changing so rapidly. I think there's a lot of technology being put out there. I've done a lot of work in the smart cities arena, for instance, and I kind of, within certain industries, so there's this term greenwashing, which basically refers to kind of, company or a group kind of publicly building up their ecological and environmental credentials and kind of, supporting things, but then not tackling the underlying practices, that's, that they've got there. And I think that kind of can be applied to ethics as well. And I think we're kind of seeing an ethics washing in certain cities, for instance, going on, where people are, I think there's been a lot of technologies. Many cities have been deploying technologies, for instance, and in a very rapid fashion. Some are trying to be kind of leaders and etc. And they've been doing that without a lot of frameworks, without a lot of discussion, about who's responsible, who owns the data, and what's kind of. And I think kind of there's been a bit of a lashback in the last couple of years. And I think that's happened. There are now kind of consortiums coming together, etc. But there's a question of like how much is really kind of effectual. How much is really happening here. And I think it's a very different story in different cities, but it's something that a lot of cities right now, and all the partners in those kind of test beds, those living labs, etc. Kind of are working through.
To me, that raises a question that was brought up in what you guys were talking about before we closed the sessions, which was around a lot of these questions are being asked from a technological standpoint, and the frameworks are being built from that standpoint too. How do we elevate the role of the social sciences here for things like that, but also in organisations? We have CTOs and CIOs and CFOs and CPOs, but is there a chief behavioural or social science role to be played here? And if there is, what are the problems that we can tackle, and how should we be tackling them?
So as a technologist, I'll take on the job of defending the social scientists and anthropologists.
That's what I like to hear.
The cross-disciplinary action, or team working in action. So it's an interesting, we've been doing something recently where, over the last few years, we've been taking technology that's developed for one application, which is Mars exploration, and deploying it in a very different set of environments. And it's primarily usually to sort of take people out of very dangerous environments. And it's interesting that journey in a way, because quite often it comes down to a situation where there's the value assessment of this thing we're doing, right, and the impact of it. And obviously when it's in a commercial situation, it's really about the value, the commercial value really, sort of pounds, euros and everything else. But what we discover quite often is that people currently don't understand their current workflow and where it's inefficient, or where the value could be improved. And I'm using value in a very broad sense here. I mean, it could involve the safety of people. And, if your employees are tired in a dangerous situation, how does that affect the judgments they make? The judgments they make are usually then influencing for example, the safety of infrastructure we use every day. So this whole process of the existing manual workflow, if you could put it like that, is not fully well understood. So as we come along with technologies and say we could do this, the impact of that is then also not understood. So I think the answer to that is usually that means it's a business case, is what, for example, the C-suite will look to. But to create that thing is definitely you're going to need a team of different professions to create that thing. It's going to need social science, it's going to need anthropology, it's going to need the technology, it's going to need the legal aspects, and indeed the sort of economic side of things to come up with a thing that says, if this is the existing workflow, here's how we could improve it for everybody's sake, and this is what that will look like, as a commercial proposition, for example. So the answer is, it's a team effort, I think.
Perhaps in a slightly different way as well. I think we talk about elevating social sciences, say, within the C-suite, and I think it's important to be for anthropologists to be able to go and involve themselves at that level, and talk with people and kind of influence there. And if you can get the buy-in of those groups, then that really does tend to make your life a lot easier when it comes to getting access and doing things. But really, I think the role of the anthropologist as well is to kind of be having and really think about many audiences and that they're going to work with, and perhaps you're working with, say, a company or something, then, or if you're working with a city or whatever group you go into, then I've found it that the projects that we would engage in, tend not to be very successful if you just got the buy-in of the C-suite. I think kind of work through many of the stakeholders, and it's often about finding champions to kind of take on projects and work with you, and so that's a piece of work that we as anthropologists have to do as well.
The problems we're kind of facing and tackling today, right, are messy and vague and transcend all of these disciplines and boundaries, but sometimes I feel like the disciplinary boundaries are kind of, the walls are going up versus coming down. I remember in my first job, we were all called research scientists, regardless of our background and what we did and where we came from. And we focused on the problem at hand. We didn't focus on, this is my discipline and I can only do this thing, and this is your discipline, you can only do this thing. How do anthropologists and technologists work together? Do we need to be looking at hybrid people and businesses, or can we create some kind of common foundational language that enables us to tackle the development of AI from a very different perspective? David, I'm going to throw that at you first.
Thanks. Yeah, I think kind of I speak to a lot of anthropologists who are kind of embarking on careers. They'll finish their PhDs and they go into different industries and they're working. And I think a lot of them, there are a lot of people who find it very, very difficult to engage and get involved in the teams, and sometimes, including big projects, maybe H2020 projects, or an engineering physical sciences research council project, which has required some social science engagement, but then they're brought in. Often anthropologists are brought in, or social scientists are brought in, and then sequestered from the team, so to some degree, they're kind of given a particular critical role, and I'm not saying this is always the case, but I'm saying that I've been asked in the past to come and talk to conferences, say, of biosynth anthropologists who are kind of trying to deal with these problems. So I think the position of the anthropologist in the team is incredibly important, and it's something that we have to think about. I think, we have to think about I've been involved in setting up a number of research centres across multiple institutions, and I've often found that while slip services placed at the beginning to, especially during the funding application phases, to kind of multidisciplinarity, actually carrying that out in practice, unless people have worked together for a long time, can be sometimes that people then won't kind of pursue that all the way once the money's in, etc. And sometimes I found that, teams then, they've established their priorities and they're kind of working on theirs, and they're not kind of looking at bringing two teams together to tackle things. And where I have found that really works is when when the project programs are arranged more of a transdisciplinary perspective, which to me means about bringing different disciplines and their skills and their insights together to tackle a really difficult challenge or wicked problem. And that is, and if you do that with real world stakeholders in context, in situations that there's a lot of dependencies upon the different parts of the team kind of working together to kind of develop something or an artifact, or to do the research around that and think about how to do that in a sensitive fashion for all the different workflows and practices that they're now going into, because they go into a real environment. That does tend to really focus the mind.
But isn't the problem sometimes earlier in a way? You're talking about funding bids, and a lot of this is obviously university driven.
Sure.
But when I look at undergraduate degrees, certainly where I've seen higher education across the UK and Germany, it is very siloed. So our young people are accustomed to silos in their undergraduate degree. There are hardly any functional, proper cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary projects. As you say, lip service, even in undergraduate or master's education, is quite common. So I think once you get the people come out the other side, and they're then suddenly is expected to have these skills and this awareness, I think it needs to start much earlier.
I really agree with that. I think we do need to reflect upon our pedagogy and our approaches to I mean, as anthropologists, we often encouraged, to go out into the field for a long time and be relatively isolated. You're out by yourself. You're not working as part of a team, often in the traditional model. I think, certainly I think this is changing in a lot of methods courses, but I think we do need to also train anthropologists, and I know many of you in the room, and I love going to a conference like this because I see anthropologists up here talking to multiple audiences. But if you go to like the AAA, one of the anthropology conferences, everyone's reading their papers. It's very much kind of focused on, there's a performance, but it's just a performance within a small field.
But how do we, I think there's definitely an intention here, right, to say that the intent is here to say that we need to work differently and all the rest of it. We had a call to action for really transdisciplinary teams and all the rest of it. But we seem to be paying lip service to this for the most part. How do we really do this? So, I try to do this in my daily life. I think we all do, but where is this really working, and how do we really make this work? Because otherwise we're at a point where it's very nice that we consider and say that this needs to happen. We acknowledge that it needs to happen. But as you said yourself, right, you've got a team here and a team here, and things have kicked off and they're not working together. How do we get to a point where we can solve problems where...
Yeah, and that was actually, this forced us to kind of rethink about how we approached research in this way, and we kind of spent a lot of time then going out and building projects, and with... That would require, working with a city council or a public park or whatever, and actually bringing those right down into the undergraduate as well. And so we kind of, we in a much smaller scale, kind of working with lots of different groups, small scale like men's sheds or whatever, and working through some of this with them. But did you want to?
Well, I was going to make sort of two comments. So one is that I actually think this concern, I don't think this concern is a new one.
Exactly.
Even just in my life in academia, we've talked about funding bids, which I know won't be of relevance to everyone in the room, but at least when there is an impact agenda, and at least we're now being asked to show our pathways to societal benefit in one way or another, be that economic or health related or social. So I think I think there are some I think we're in a better place right now, both in terms of funding streams and actually in terms of taking the example of undergraduate training. I think there have been really quite brave and ambitious attempts to provide some transdisciplinary training for undergraduates in lots of different programs, certainly in universities I've worked in. So I actually think we're going in the right direction. From my own experience as a researcher, the projects where I think this integration of the social and, for example, engineering and physical sciences, where that works best is where the challenge is shared.
Yes.
And where it's important enough for everyone to buy into.
Yeah.
I'll give an example of that. So coming from a kind of data science perspective and a biological anthropological perspective, one of the projects they've been involved in recently is one around forensic identification from photographs in a humanitarian context. And there, I think, in that sort of NGO humanitarian sector, there has been a huge effort to bring together anthropologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, data scientists, and it's worked really well. And we now see open data sets using the HDX format, which are available for research and training, and so I think it's a combination of having a shared societal challenge which is significant, and having a project which is integrative at all levels, from the most junior to the most senior. And if you can lever both of those things, you will have a successful kind of translation of knowledge and expertise across sectors.
And that's probably the reason why we don't have any social scientists at C-suite level, because there isn't that sort of bringing together like there is in research. There's budgets, there is power involved, and it reminds me of diversity challenges at C-level anyway, at C-suite level anyway. So it's quite similar, I think, to the gender challenges that we've got at C-suite level as well. Very similar.
5 minutes, sorry. You should have known when you moved that way, Dawn, that something was going to happen. All right. I'm going to throw this out to the audience. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask the panel? Anything that you've been thinking about during the day? Any questions that have arisen from what we've been talking about? I see a hand over there, sorry.
Hi, thanks very much. Before I ask my question, I'm struck by the kind of mythology around the use of the word AI. Too often in conversations become clear that it's an excuse or a reason not to inquire and not to ask questions. So my provocative suggestion is we stop using the word AI and say things like it's an algorithm written by a person to a specification that may or may not be tested. That's long. It's not going to happen. But in over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been encouraging everyone I meet, including children, to move away from the mythology. My real question or comment is, I'm detecting a certain pessimism around, you called it verification, in terms of the engineering context, unknown consequences, that sort of thing. But there are plenty of other fields from other engineering disciplines where we have that uncertainty, we have that kind of lack of determinism about an outcome, but we develop ways of dealing with it, quantifying it. And the strongest parallels that I can see are to the field of information security, where people are involved, don't know what's going to happen, various levels of risk, but at some point we've developed a mature enough method of packaging it so that people at their various roles, whether it's the public, whether it's the C-suite, whether it's the regulator, whether it's the jury in a court, can understand it well enough for us to make progress and have safe enough systems. I just wanted to say that I don't think we should be as pessimistic as we are.
Well, that's about explainability partly, isn't it, of AI processes, of algorithms that are underlying it, and that they're transparent and can be explained, and accountability. And I just wonder whether the Frightful Five are that interested in creating that transparency and that explainability, so that the big guys like Amazon, Google. I just wonder. But I'm with you. If we could achieve that step by step, then there's lots of positives.
Okay.
I think, sorry, the microphone's gone away. I'll just say one last thing. Some of these incentives have to come from law, because at the C-suite, too often they're responding to how do we stay within the law, how do we remain profitable, how do we avoid fines. So you've asked lots of questions, and in my mind all day I've been thinking, it's got to be law. There's got to be a punishment, a cost to bad behaviour. I will shut up now, thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got 2 minutes left, so one question. We've got 1 minute left and one question.
Yep.
Let's go.
Okay, I'll make it short. That's really hard. No, but I just wanted to point out Cassie Kosurkov, the chief decision scientist at Google, and I think she's really awesome and worth following on Medium. But what do you think about Nick Clegg? It's a really, I guess, a tough question in UK. But he's now sort of responsible for policy sort of across Facebook. And I think that's an interesting question that, worth discussing when we have so many different people. But we only have 1 minute, so yeah.
That was a very open question.
He did an undergraduate degree in anthropology.
Did he?
Start.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll land that with a
I just
food
changed
for
my
thought
answer.
for everyone in the room to discuss over whatever's happening next. So thank you for that. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.